In this video, I'll be going over the solution to Monsters Battle from February Lunchtime 2020. So basically, each player is trying to maximize the sum of his alive monsters minus the sum of his opponents. So from this, we have two obvious observations. The first one is that we should attack, the player should attack with the least value monster that he has in attack mode. And he should choose the least valued monster so that when he attacks with this monster, it becomes in defense mode, and then if the other player chooses to attack this monster, then he will lose less value than if he chose a monster with greater value. And then similarly, he should attack the most valued monster of his opponent in defense mode. And this is to minimize the sum of his opponent's alive monsters. So let's have a function called play. So basically, given the monsters which are in attack mode and for player 1, and the monsters which are in attack mode in defense mode for player 1, and the monsters which are in attack mode for player 2, and the monsters which are in defense mode for player 2, it will return the maximum of the sum of player 1's monsters minus the sum of the player 2's monsters. So the first thing that player 1 can do is he can simply just stop the game at the beginning of his turn, and if that happens, then the value that he'll get is simply the sum of all the monsters that he has right now minus the sum of his opponent's monsters. And the second thing that player 1 can do is he can choose a monster he can attack one of his opponent's defense monsters with one of his attack monsters. So if attack 1 is not empty and defense 2 is not empty, that means he can't attack. And by the two observations I mentioned earlier, the monster from player 1 should be the minimum in attack 1, and the monster from player 2 should be the maximum in defense 2. And then when we attack, after we attack, monster 1 becomes defense. So we remove monster 1 from attack 1, and then we add monster 1 to defense 1. And then also monster 2 dies, so we remove monster 2 from defense 2. And then after that happens, it's now player 2's turn. So in order to find the value for player 2, what we can do is we can call the play function again, except this time it's player 2's turn, so we put attack 2, the sets attack 2 and defense 2 at the beginning, and then player 1 becomes the second player, so attack 1 and defense 1 go in the end. And then we have this negative sign over here, because notice that this function will return the sum of player 2 minus player 1, but we want the sum of player 1 minus player 2. So in order to change that, we just add a negative sign. So value 2 is the value we get if player 1 chooses to attack. And in order to find the best value, we just take the maximum of value 1 and value 2. Okay, so let's look at the code right now. So first, we input the data, and then we find the sum of the monster values for player 1 and player 2, as well as the multi-set of the monsters which are in attack and defense mode for both players. And then for each player, we input the data for the monsters, and then we update the sums and the multi-sets for each player. And after we input that, we just call our play function over here. And in order to calculate the answer quickly, in addition to passing on the multisets, we will also pass the sum of the values of the monsters into this play function. And then for the multisets of the monsters, notice that I'm passing the multisets by reference, because if we don't pass by reference, then the multisets will be copied every time we call the function, which will make it very slow. And for the rest of the function, the code is really similar to the pseudocode I showed here earlier. This should be pretty straightforward. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the solution. So if this was helpful, then feel free to like and subscribe.